The Brandon Peters Show may contain explicit language and detailed plot points. For more information on the show, stay tuned to the end of the episode. And now, here he is, Brandon.
Welcome back to the Brandon Peters Show, coming to you live. Well, recording this live at the time. We're not live. From the recording of the summer of 2015 at 10. Middle of that. You'll hear that this summer. But joining me today from Puck News and the Outside Scoop, which today is Casino Royale, a yummy treat that dares you to stare down the barrel of a crunchy waffle cone as you finish off your choice of ice cream scoop, syrup, and one topping. Offer ends Friday. And from Out Now with Aaron and Abe, We Live Entertainment, and the all-new Two Black Guys Talk Godzilla, I believe he's attempting re-entry, Aaron Neuwirth.
I don't think he said Scott Mendelson after that. I think he just read the
it was Scott Mendelson. Everybody knows Scott Mendelson. Scott Mendelson. I just ran through there.
I have a name, damn it. I've given you my soul.
Don't you know who I am?
By the way, that one topping, bullets.
Shell casings. You can use them as scoops.
Yeah.
There we go. All right. So a little under 2 weeks ago, it was announced that the Broccoli family, mainly Barbara Broccoli and her stepbrother, Michael G. Wilson, which, fun fact, his stepdad is the guy who put Bond in cinemas, and his real dad is the first live-action cinematic Batman. Crazy shit. Yeah.
I didn't know that.
Oh, you did? Yeah, Lewis Wilson, the first cinematic Batman in the movie serials, is his dad. And then,
if it wasn't for him, Dr. Daka would have won World War II.
Right? If you want to watch some crazy, dated stuff, yeah, that was the
problem is
the fear
of those two serials. The first one, very racist, but enjoyable. The second one, not as racist, but very boring.
And using footage from the original where needed.
Yes.
That's how I felt about Obama's first two terms. Lots of racist, but enjoyable. Second term, more boring.
All right. So those two relinquished all creative control of the James Bond film property, moving forward to that of Amazon, and this just felt like a giant. We've had almost 2 weeks to settle in this. Scott's podcast, Outside Scoop, touched on it on their episode roughly after it came out. But it felt like a giant gut punch, as Bond in cinema had been a family-owned and operated franchise for its entire run, so it had a certain flair to it. And yeah, it's just like, what? You didn't think this would happen, but it did. And I want to note that there were times we do have Bond without Broccoli influence. We have the Casino Royale TV episode of Climax from 1954. Casino Royale, the 1967 comedy movie. It's very lame and boring, Nancy Burns. Never Say Never Again was there. And then we also
otherwise known as Johnny English Origins.
Yes, true. And to mention before, we got our tangents, because we're probably going to talk about spin-off stuff here, but James Bond Jr., the cartoon series.
Scott's beloved James Bond Jr.
Oh, yes. James Bond Jr. chases scum around the world.
So, yeah, this is keys, but like, they've run this well-oiled machine for over 60 years now. 25 films, different actors, able to relaunch Bond successfully, unsuccessfully, taking time. But it always felt like they know what they're doing. And now we give it to the Blofeld, the corporate overlord of Jeff Bezos. And I'm going to start here with our thoughts on this and our fears of what come of this, because I'm just like, Like while I will put myself like I've said recently a lot. James Bond, like Batman, I will say I feel I have been beyond fulfilled in terms of getting 25 Bond movies, great Bonds, good one, like all this stuff. I'm not pining for the return. Once the return happens, it'll kick the rust off my tires and I'll follow with great interest. But I feel like I've had the gamut like Batman of like all the stuff I've wanted to see and more. Uh and so I'm not like I wasn't like chomping at the bit for this new Bond to come back, but there we go. But I mean, the first thing that kicks this off that makes me have these worries in my head. But then there's Bezos tweeting, "Who should be the next James Bond?" The absolute worst way to cast James Bond, and one of my first like, oh, they're gonna fuck this up thing
Well,
because
that's
Leslie
the
Jones
people
passed
never
recently.
know. The people never know what they want. The nerds, if I mean, yeah. So,
that, that,
um,
that's the area that I'm most like concerned with. How much we're going to give in to consumer demand, I guess. As a like, we can talk about the
percepted consumer demand. I would
yes.
Yes.
say
We,
percepted.
Listening to the internet.
we can talk about the notion of how much they're going to like add quantity wise. That's certainly a good question to get into, but
Hmm.
I'm less concerned there and more concerned with how much are we going to appease the internet essentially.
Yeah.
And I worry about that just because I've seen it happen with the biggest franchise in the world, Star Wars. So Bond feels less safe in this scenario because yes, it's not there's so many factors there, right? It's Amazon and MGM, but Amazon where it's like it's not like it's not like a giant studio. It's this kind of where MGM, yes, but Amazon, they're kind of going to do whatever they think makes the most sense in a way that I don't know is going to be the most uh positive. So as a result, you'll get like any chance I thought that like Dev Patel might be Bond has diminished significantly at this
It's
point.
immediately become, oh, it's probably gonna be a white dude again.
Yeah, it's probably gonna be a white like the idea of giving it any sense of how can we like legitimately think this through and in a like a reach a decision that makes the sense of this is what we want to do, this is what we think is right for Bond. Even if the Broccoli's and Wilson did cast like another white dude, I'd still like to think that the process that them to get there came through a lot of thinking it out and everything. Where now it just feels like whatever that whatever that's going to be is going to be rooted in we think this works because that's what the algorithms say works best, therefore we don't need to creatively think about this, we're just thinking about the numbers involved. I feel like there's just going to be a lot of limits as far as what can we do to actually make this a unique entry in the Bond history, and that's what worries me most about this.
Yeah. Um. Yeah, Scott.
I obviously agree. I mean, beyond just don't listen to the internet, because that's, we've been having that conversation for at least a decade. When even I would argue franchises like the MCU that previously were very good about not listening to the internet and, ignoring that nonsense and just keep moving forward and, things will out accordingly. I think even they have sort of fall into that trap a bit, whether it's them or whether it's their Disney overlords, all due respect, I don't know. Um, I do believe, you have an Amazon that paid like $9 billion, ridiculous amount of money for MGM, a studio that I'm 44 years old. I've been following this stuff since at least I was 8 or 9. And I don't remember a time in my life when MGM wasn't either trying to get bought or about to go bankrupt.
Right.
So the idea that this was this, when the deal happened in 2021, it's this game changer. And they're like, no, it's fucking MGM. They have Bond. They have a handful of other franchises that apparently make a few bucks, or you know, theoretically make a few bucks here and there, like Rocky, if we're being honest. But otherwise, they are Bond, and the concern, to the extent that it matters, because as Brandon said, we've in retrospect, I wonder if it was very intentional that No Time to Die ended with James Bond being blown to bits. And the idea that, like, bye bye, it's your problem now.
It's odd
And
now that
metaphorically
yeah.
speaking, Yeah, metaphorically speaking, even if the franchise is terrible from here on in, we'll always have these 25, 26 pictures that were the broccoli era. Um, but because they paid so much money for Bond, because there's so much quote unquote writing on it, I cannot see them being, I don't want to say smart enough, courageous enough to make something like Casino Royale that, oh no, it only made $600 million, but everybody really fucking liked it. And the franchise is on very good footing here, and we're gonna get that breakout sequel or two down the line. It's almost like you almost have to think, okay, what does the machine say is most likely to give us Skyfall numbers right out of the gate?
Yeah.
And even though I will argue that's not true, quite the contrary, that the more you try to make a stereotypical $1 billion grosser, the less likely you're going to get a $1 billion grosser. Exhibit A, Justice League. Are they going to be able to give the likes of Courtney Valenti and friends the freedom to say, okay, the most important thing is that you make a Bond film that is really fucking good, that stands out among the blockbuster crowd, the franchise world, and frankly, a world where, television spy shows like, ironically, Reacher and Jack Ryan, whatever, to a certain extent are able to deliver the comparable thrills on television to what was once associated only with the big screen 007 adventures. And they've been straddling that line since GoldenEye.
Isn't that Richard Madden series that's on Amazon like a Bond ripoff that cost them like?
Oh yeah, with the Russo brothers, who they could
tons of the Citadel.
Please don't call them Bezos. Please do not call the Russos.
Do not call Agbo. Or if they call you, block the number.
Well, my thing, Scott, too, like one of the things is like, I wouldn't put it past them to make a pretty good, liked, successful first movie out. It's how they're going to respond to that success that's key. Because if they have one out the gate, if they have a Force Awakens style breakout Bond hit out the gate, are you just they're going to be too antsy to put as much out there as they can. And that's a problem.
Well, that's what I wonder. Like if that's the case and they get, which makes, if you have to think reasonably, that's what you do, right? You make a good first outing that's quote unquote safe, but acceptable. And if it's, slightly above average, say we do, not Scott, good. Right? Like that's nice. Now, is the response after that going to be a last Jedi, which all of us agree, great, where it was, let's capitalize on the success by taking more risks, or do you double down on the safe factor and just try to do that again? What's interesting with Bond is that kind of works for Bond. You look at the ones that, follow up a huge success of another one. You go from gold, you go for the first four, that's or first five, and it's hit after hit after hit. They're just doubling that. But especially if you look at like Goldfinger to Thunderball or Spy Who Loved Me to Moonraker, and this is where people are going to be like Moonraker, and we're going to be like, well, Moonraker was the giant hit that it was, and just remade the previous movie. I mean, if that's a possibility that could go in its favor, but again, it's hard to predict with something like this.
It's not like the Broccoli's don't make this mistake too, because
of course
GoldenEye, they rushed Tomorrow Never Dies, which didn't have a completed script going into shooting, and then after Casino, they rushed into Quantum to one, capitalize on Craig, and two, beat a writer's strike.
The interesting thing about Tomorrow Never Dies, and this goes to what both of you are saying, is that along with being, basically a remake of, the stereotypical Lewis Gilbert Bond with a tit for tat, yada, 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 that felt to me like the most prototypical Bond movie you could imagine.
Right.
That's not even a criticism. I enjoy that one. It's a very good example of a 3-star Bond film. But, yeah.
And I was going to say that, I mean, that's what's interesting with Bond, like, as you already mentioned Yancey earlier, I would agree with him that for a series that's lasted this long and has this many entries, it's impressive how strong the batting average is on an overall level. So it's like, even if you do, the one outlier in that for me is like Quantum, because it's such a it feels like such a deliberate attempt to do something wildly different as opposed to being like just make more of Casino. For the most part, when you get like a Tomorrow Never Dies, which is just like a down the middle Bond
Mhm.
movie, it still basically works. So can Amazon be that studio that can rise to that challenge at least enough to just deliver a good Bond movie on a consistent basis? That's the hope that I have.
Yeah, if
Obviously, the ultimate hope is that they're great Bond movies, but
unlike other places that have picked up properties, Bond is a longevity one. You shouldn't be thinking about instant success. They're like, how do we sustain success for 20 years with Bond? And it's not like that's not put it make the one thing with Bond has been able to do in the post Dalton era is create demand and excitement for his return every time. And Craig did it multiple times. Daniel Craig, Casino Royale, new Bond, Bond's back to basics, blah, blah, blah. Skyfall, Bond's back. He's been gone for like 4 years. Spectre was a couple years. Blofeld's back. And then No Time to Die, the grand finale we waited on for, delay, COVID, blah, blah, blah. But there was always a sense of being patient, letting some years go by, and coming back to Bond. And I don't know that Amazon would be that patient. I do think Amazon will, I don't think they'll forgo theatrical with Bond. I would hope not.
no. I
No.
mean, they're putting movies in theaters now. They're not
Yeah.
Netflix.
Yeah. So I just, and my thing is, I've stressed like I think Scott and I did a DC universe retrospective.
I was there. I had a map.
Right. And at the end of it, one of my big things I said that I didn't want with that going forward, which I'll say with Bond and a lot of other things, is like, I don't give a fucking flip about cinematic universes at all anymore. I don't need them. I don't want them. Bond, I want to see James Bond. I want to see his adventure. That's what I don't want an M show. I don't want a Money Penny show. I don't, like, why are we doing all this? Like,
I mean, yeah, that's
that's where they're going to start mining.
This is the fear.
Auric Goldfinger, the
I
new
don't
series
know-
coming.
I don't know that. I fear that. Sure, if I want to go
this is fear. Yeah,
if I want to go worst case scenario, absolutely. That's what I do not want to see. I'd like to think that there's ideally someone that's smart enough to realize the things that us average people are saying out loud as far as what makes this thing special, and looking at the world around them with other franchises that once were regarded as special and aren't so much anymore. Like, it's weird to think that Jurassic still feels special compared to Star Wars. Like, that's nuts to me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's insanity. But I like to and that's me being very earnest and optimistic that there are people that are smart enough to understand how has this been a consistently pretty good at least action franchise that's gone from the 60s to now and hasn't had to do a lot to really shake things around beyond literally change the casting based on age. Like,
And I'm gonna hope too with that like they quickly realize that James Bond's not Marvel, and I'm gonna give the Marvel DC mining of stuff with how much spinoff that's the comic book way that they've taken to movies. It's just now in the recent few years, the common moviegoers realize, oh, this is why I don't read comic books. This is why I'm not a comic book person. And, as ridiculous as like having an Alfred TV show is, there's probably comics out there that were Alfred spinoffs.
what's the full title of that Alfred TV show?
Pennyworth? Isn't it
It's
Pennyworth?
like, is it Pennyworth, like the story of Batman's butler? Like, isn't that like
Or
the whole
something.
I don't know. I'm
Yeah.
not a fucking nerd. Jesus.
But yeah, sorry, Peter. So like, yeah, I get, when we're all bitching about Marvel and you have to watch all this, I'm like, well, that's kind of like they're comic book movies and they're doing comic book things. Like,
Well,
okay, I will.
For me, and this sort of gets into the whole spin-off, no spin-off, whatever. I mean, in a theoretically sane ecosystem, even if Amazon did greenlight and produce half a dozen James Bond spin-offs, as long as there was it was in a world in which they didn't all have to get the same sky high ratings, and or none of them really had to be all that well watched, and it would not hurt the movies. Whatever. I think
What?
the issue, among others, with the Marvel shows and the Star Wars shows is that the stakes were so high and they were seen as essentially holding up the entire Disney ecosystem in this new world of streaming, that the fact that these shows did not garner the comparative equivalent of $1 billion in worldwide box office every time out, because as you know, even comic book fans, most of them don't go into the store and get every fucking Marvel title that comes out that month. They read the stuff they like, they ignore the ones they don't, and if there's a big crossover, they maybe do a little homework. So in a sane world, it would be okay that, say, the Acolyte didn't get ratings that were as big as Obi-Wan, because why would it? But so as long as spin-offs or no spin-offs, as they go into this with the understanding that as long as the movies are good and are successful and budget whatever, if you want to do a few spin-offs, as long as we understand that these are not do or die situations, they are additive for those that want them, then I think that's a very different situation from what we kind of had with the Disney, the 2020s for Disney, where these Marvel shows were considered must succeed on apples and oranges, the level of the movies, and it hurt the movies when they weren't.
While I continue to walk past the notion of Scott calling somebody a nerd and not trying to see the irony in that statement, I look at the caveats.
Oh, I'm well of the irony. That's why it's funny.
Sure. That's I look at the caveats you're having to give to the idea of let's say 3 Bond shows that pop up, and it's like it has to be non-intrusive, has to be good, it has to I don't know, not upset the fan base for whatever. That's a lot.
Yeah.
In this age, that's a lot / near impossible. Like when and at least Amazon seems willing to be like, let's open up the purse so they can spend money on them, because among the issues with the Marvel shows is they just don't look very good. Like there's nothing about them that makes me want to watch them again, because it's like, why? They're not particularly cinematic. Like there's nothing there. They're not. There's so much built on plot momentum, even though they're also boring. Which is like, huh? It's like, what's the majesty that comes from rewatching these shows? At least the Bond series presumably would probably be good to look at. Like they probably hire directors that know what they're doing to some degree. And but even then it's like, what am I getting out of this? What am I getting out of out of Hugo Drax, the origin story?
Yeah.
And what's Moneypenny doing after work? It's like, what's the payoff here? Does this connect to the grander thing? And I don't necessarily care either way about that as far as that factor, but an audience online and in general they'll be like, so I'm watching this, I guess, because I need to, maybe, and then the movie, do I need that? Like it just becomes this confusing mess of a thing. And then if the show that's all assuming the show is watchable. If it's not good, or it just is boring, or it's just not taken, it's accepted like the Acolyte, where a handful of people are like, this is ambitious, and the rest are like, 2 black bombs, bad. Like,
let's be in the space witches.
What's
what?
what was the gain in all of this for a franchise that didn't need any of this? At least Star Wars and Marvel have a world to explore that's yeah, it's a universe. Sure, that makes sense. What's there's no inherent value in Bond being finally the other corners of MI6 are being explored to their fullest extent.
Right.
That's what we've been missing all of these years. That's why this franchise has been successful since the 60s.
We'll get the lower decks of James Bond.
Even then, that's a
branch.
universe.
Yeah. No, yeah. I'm not saying I want them. I'm not.
No, I know you're not saying that. It's just
the
ingredients needed to make that a success seems so impossible to hit. With a surety that it's why even try? And that, Brandon, you mentioned early on, this was a family franchise essentially.
Yeah.
And I think a big part of what makes that work is exactly the longevity of it all is the fact it might just be a British sensibility, patience. They have the patience to do this thing. Granted, Amazon, when it comes to their shows, they're happy waiting 2-3 years before they give you another season of something. So I guess patience is in their playbook also. But with this, like if in between Bond movies, we're like, don't worry, we have 3 8-episode series coming. Fuck that. I don't want
Yeah.
that at all.
Yeah,
I agree. I do think there isn't much harm in having like maybe one Felix Leiter spinoff show that, fingers crossed, is as good as, say, a better than average season of Jack Reacher. Because I
But
think,
finally, an action show based on the CIA. We'll get one of those.
yeah, not Jack Reacher, Jack Ryan. Reacher is a high bar. That's fucking
Yeah.
awesome. But
well, also too, everybody just assumes with like stuff that people mind, but like, what has Amazon on a property they've had that they've exploited the hell out of? They have Lord of the Rings, but they just have done one show. And then The Boys has a spinoff that I didn't realize existed, and I've never watched.
I enjoyed it.
And then does the Invincible have a spinoff?
No, not
yet.
yet. And
Yeah.
that's also because the comics don't have spin-offs either. So,
But yeah, I can't think of anything else that they've like really abused the shit out of. I think
I'm inclined to
everybody's just thinking, and I hate to give the corporate overlord the benefit of the doubt, but everybody's going, well, look what Disney did when they got Star Wars. And that's the go-to with this. And it's not like
that was one of the first examples of that being able to be done commercially in this
Yeah.
new ecosystem.
I'd argue The Boys is the closest they've gotten, and exploit is a tough word because
Mhm.
it's not like The Boys stuff has been bad, or at least relatively speaking, hasn't
Right.
been bad. It's all paid off for them.
Mhm.
Gen V is a fun show that got decent reviews, and they've had other like games or like they've had other like things to explore because it's that kind of a thing. Like that makes sense.
comic book stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, it's comic book. The difference is, and like Reacher's about to get a spinoff too with the female character that he's like friends with. These aren't bad things inherently, but also those are small potatoes. I mean, like ultimately, it's if you like this thing, hey, you can try out this. If it doesn't work, we'll cancel it. Like that's not a big deal in the scheme of things. Bond is huge, right?
Yeah.
And
It's an event.
yes, and while I already said I think that's a worst case scenario that we'd actually get like if we get one, I'm not going to say fine, but I will say, yeah, that makes sense. But if we got, if if the idea of getting multiple versions of this coming at us, that it's just dancing with like the wrong kind of fire, and it just feels like that would be a bad end game for all
Yeah.
of this if they really wanted to go full tilt.
So
and
Bond right now is
time
one of
in.
the few cinematic things that is special still in terms of franchise. That's not Bond's back. For a series that has 25 films, every time he comes out, it is an event, and there's nowhere else you can get James Bond other than the big screen. The minute you put him on a small screen, I think it dilutes it somewhat. I think you can still have successful films, but they won't be that event. And what you make of the film is like, I see these people wanting a 60s James Bond set. I'm like, we already have those.
Yeah.
Yes.
There's like eight of them.
They dominate. They were the Friday the 13th of the 60s, man. Like, we already have those. Like, we don't, Bond is current. Bond
I love the idea of someone being like, wait, we do?
yeah, like, we have
What if
those.
they made Die Hard in a building?
I don't, yeah, like, it's funny, like, just thinking of these things, these ideas that they might peer to, listen to, cave to because an algorithm tells them it might work. Like, I don't need Pierce Brosnan and Timothy Dalton showing up. Like, I joked there and, like, have some funeral scene for Daniel Craig's Bond, and Timothy Dalton and Pierce Brosnan are sitting there, and they give in to the Bond is a code name bullshit when it's like, folks, fuck continuity, fuck canon. It's just James Bond. Like they have to have this narrative thing. Like it's just James Bond. He's not a code name. This isn't some scroll thing. This is just our adventure going to see this secret agent. We know it's James Bond going through the thing.
We've talked about this many times on the multiple James Bond commentaries we've done it out there in a name where this whole code name theory comes up, and we all reject this not even reject because it's not like it's a possibility. It's just a thing that came up and people like latched onto.
Yeah.
I hate it. I hate it. I hate this notion. So the idea of feeding into it
Yeah.
bothers me.
Yep.
And the idea of doing like, because I know like the notion of doing like anthology Bond has been like tossed around online, not like in reality
Yeah.
because we don't know anything about reality. Like, and it's like there's a way that could work, I suppose, but it does already feel like it makes it less special because now we can like now you're just playing what if Bond. Like it's
Mm-hmm.
more and what if was not very successful in Disney for that matter. So if you start playing that game, that's diluting it too, right? Because now you're like just doing like wish fulfillment for randos, and it's like
Obi-Wan.
that's not
Yeah, you're doing
it's
Obi-Wan.
not that's not the smart play if you're trying to, like you said, establish longevity
Mm-hmm.
in a new realm of Bond. Now, like you mentioned, Scott, like we've gotten through this entire run of Bond, and we literally ended with killing him. So it's like, does that lead to a possibility of not doing what I just said, the wish fulfillment thing, but like exploring new ways to approach this series because we've had such a definitive end for this iteration that now serves as a definitive end for this era of Bond? I suppose, and that could lead to some ideally very creative ways of reigniting this series. But, going back to like the 60s and whatnot, it's like that just
Yeah,
that
that's just
feels
lazy
like
thinking.
such a niche move for like just a sect of people that just think the 60s are
Yeah.
inherently cool. Meanwhile,
Yeah.
I'm being
Well,
like,
it's also
great.
the cheat of all the filmmakers today that go back because they don't want to take the technology challenge.
I take the
Mhm.
technology challenge, but it's also always limiting because it's going to be like cast a white guy's Bond back in the 60s, and now with 2025 eyes, you can acknowledge the sexism or whatnot, but you're still not going to tackle anything interesting like the racism of the
Mm-hmm.
time that
Yeah.
like posh
Yeah.
British spies would absolutely have. Like there's so it's like, what are we doing? We're just satisfying a very specific
Yeah.
sect of fanboys that just want to see all the cool stuff that would happen in the 60s and none of the bad things that would happen in the 60s.
Right.
So there's
I mean,
nothing creative that would come out of that.
with the
Um,
continuity thing him did, you just have to accept that just Bond is. We don't need to introduce ourselves to him again. You just start off another Bond, like just run with it. Just go. It's kind of like, and with Bond, I guess I could apply my like Doctor Who mentality. It's the same thing. It's a British establishment where the lead changes all the time. But I'm like, there's an overall canon to things, a legacy, but each individual actor's era has its own canonical things to where, it's its own mini thing and it's also part of the grand thing. But it doesn't matter. Everything can change. Everything, it's okay to
I
evolve it.
happen to agree with what Jeremy said when we were discussing it I guess it'd be a week ago, which is if you take him to the 60s, you've basically surrendered the idea of James Bond being present tense relevant.
Yeah,
Yeah.
And it's like,
absolutely.
yeah,
Yeah.
it's not, and the joke, of course, is that, GoldenEye onward, they've been constantly asking, is James Bond relevant? Is James Bond relevant? And the answer has always been, at least commercially, fuck yes. And they've done that partially by the Broccoli's, I guess, by keeping their head down and just making James Bond films. And you keep the character somewhat similar, even if you change the world, you acknowledge the way that the world around him has changed, which is a simple idea. I mean, it's why the Captain America movies worked in the 2010s.
I mean, you could make him. I mean, in today's world, you could make James Bond, put into like, say, there's some country's election, and they have an idea that some other outside influence is trying to influence it, and he has to go in and find that person and make it a
James, save
smaller
us.
scale, make it a smaller scale thriller. Like, I don't know, that could be
Any
culturally
number of
relevant.
ideas are like worthy that could challenge the times because
Mm-hmm.
there's people that can do that. The notion that we have to move it around because it's easier to not have cell phones, or it's like that's bullshit. That just means
Yep.
you're not a good writer. Like just
Yep.
you
Yeah.
like I the notion of different franchises being like, well, they didn't have enough time to write this or that, or they didn't know how to deal with the things from the last movie. It's like, so find the talented person that can. Like it's not an
Well, here's the
excuse.
Yeah.
thing too.
It's
You
not
don't
it's not
have to acknowledge technology every 5 minutes. If you write it and you don't even, people won't even realize. Oh, why didn't he put it? It'll be the asshole that is terrible at watching movies that brings it up on the internet and
oh
everybody
sure.
starts to
Like
follow. Most
it's
people don't. Yeah.
Yeah, the real world
it's less
doesn't.
about the specificity of what the issue is they can't get around and more about increasing the search for that in that talent pool of people that can figure out the things
Mhm.
that you're trying to figure out. And there's such a lack of doing that because it's not just the white Chris's that we should put attention on. Look at all these blockbusters that have the exact same writers involved, and you wonder, why do these things seem so alike, and why is this not original anymore? It's because you're not looking outside the fucking box.
Yeah.
Like you're not finding the
Yeah.
people, you're not
I
finding the
mean,
Ryan Cooglers that have something to actually say about society that can also meld into the fucking franchise you're building onto. The second you
mhm.
actually do that, you find those other people that have plenty of ideas, have grown up with the exact same stuff that you have, and you actually want to say something that reflects the world around you, they're there. Like they're and I get that it's not easy and not everyone can
Mhm.
have a lucky break or whatnot, but if you're looking over and over again and getting the same results when it comes to these franchises and making an entry and it's like whatever, milk toast, like you have to ask yourself why, and then you have to look at the pattern that emerges and like do something else.
Well,
And luckily, Bond has been able to pretty much do that
yeah,
for a long time.
but here's a worry. It's a long time British establishment thing where they hire British director, that type of thing. They don't typically go outside. Are they going to keep it a British production as it has been,
Sure.
or are we going to get Len Wiseman directing James Bond?
I say, I mean, this is just
Sorry to
subjective. You
listener Len
keep it.
Wiseman.
Yeah.
So,
I say you keep
You
it
know what
British.
you
That's part of
did.
that's among other things what helps it stand out from the pack.
Yeah.
If if it comes off as too much distinctly American, whatever the fuck that means in 2025.
He's a British spy. It should be from a British lens
Yeah.
or something close.
I remember when the Harry Potter books/films were coming out in her pre-asshole era, people were always asking J.K. Rowling if we'd ever have an American student at Hogwarts. Like, who gives a fuck?
You
It's
don't
a
have,
British
yeah.
boarding school.
Yeah. Well, I mean, now to just note the facts, in the early 80s and some of the 70s, there was a thought maybe an American James Bond. And
yeah, James
James
Brolin.
Brolin screen tested. There was a time where they thought maybe Burt Reynolds should replace Sean Connery. There was these things have happened. James Brolin literally screen tested because they didn't. There's a weird period after Moonraker where they go 3 movies and they don't know if Roger Moore wants to even come back or ask, and then he just shows up and is like, "We doing this?" It's really odd. Like
We're
they
also
don't.
in a zone back then where these things aren't that serious as far, there's not Twitter shouting at you because you,
Yeah.
you dared to morph with a thing. It's like, yeah, there was 2 of these guys. We'll do a third one. Maybe it'll be something like this. It's not now where like the devotion to everything that's a staple of the franchise needs to be blessed and honored in the best of
You
ways.
remember
That's
when
not,
that guy?
that's not me saying don't be British anymore. I agree with you guys. I do think there's an inherent uh, uh, value in having Bond be rooted in a very specific place. That doesn't
Mhm.
necessarily mean he needs to be a stiff upper lip white guy. I do think there's very interesting ways to handle someone like a Dev Patel that have an
Mhm.
interesting, experience having grown up and being coming a spiral with that. And there's other options as well. But having it rooted in specifically in the UK, that leads to ways to explore this, or ways to explore other parts of the world because of it's based in the UK. That
Right.
I think makes a lot more sense than daring to move it out or having more influence from American directors or that dastardly Lee Tamahori from New Zealand. Making
Well, we had an Australian James Bond
Yes, we
too.
did.
I think 2 things on that note. First of all, I mean, if Burt Reynolds had taken over for Sean Connery, do you think we'd still be talking about James Bond in the
No,
present tense?
it would have
Nope.
faded out in the 80s.
I mean, these things that and when you talk about them being, less being at risk, yes, you're not dealing with the attention economy and all that entails, but also like in the 70s and even the 80s, it's like if one of these films quote unquote bombs and only does 150 worldwide on a 30 budget, it's not the end of the world.
Mhm.
I mean, yes, License to Kill was a disappointment and caused, among other things, course correction, delays, blah, blah, blah. Although I don't know if that's a cart before the horse situation, but the film still made like 145 million on a 35 budget. It was not a money losing disaster in any sense of the word. And so,
it's just a
they
cause for maybe they aren't vibing with this new guy or whatever.
Yeah.
But
so that they also, and this hopefully is where Amazon's deep pockets will come in, where they can afford to fail, or they can afford to play trial and error to a certain extent, whether that's what do we want in the broad scheme, or let's do something weird for this Bond film. And if it doesn't work, well, there'll be another one in 3 years.
The only issue I have is that, back then they could just, keep going and still do the same thing, where now would a failure in Bond lead to, let's just give them what they want. Here's Tom Hiddleston. Like,
Yeah.
let's
Well,
just
that's what I mean. I'm
we
hoping
have-
the deep pockets will mean that
No, I get that they can afford to
Yeah.
do that, but my worry is that their instincts will be like, well, in order to satiate the fact that we have this money to spend, we'll
Yes.
give them a bone and dive into, fan fiction and make that movie. And then that movie's a success, and then they keep making that movie.
Yeah, they.
No, I absolutely agree.
Yeah, and I want to put out there too that you said Hiddleston, but we've seen plenty of Henry Cavill playing spies. We're good.
Oh, have we?
We good. We good.
Has he ever had facial hair?
I even like the one. I mean, he was good in Fallout, and I like
Good in
Man from Uncle. Yeah, but we're good. We are.
Well,
we are.
Mission Impossible. I was like Amazon Fallout. My head spinned for a second.
And that one Interstellar guy, great fucking director, but I think he's made enough Bond films.
So
I don't need subtext made text for him. He's got.
You think that scrappy Spielberg guy will be able to get in under his
Finally.
50 years after the fact?
He scratched that itch so many times and is like, I'm good.
if you don't want to do it and get Mangold,
Probably, yeah.
yeah.
Probably would
So,
do it.
so like, okay, so we're talking a lot of fears here, but I want to spin to like what
Yeah,
would
let's go to the other side.
what would make you more confident that they may be doing it right and everything else with James Bond? Like, let's talk like, okay, filmmaker wise, what kind of filmmaker would it be that you'd be like, okay, and as long as you're like, okay, if they let this guy do it,
A veteran nuts and bolts studio programmer, and we
Yeah.
can debate to what extent that still exists and what would qualify in this day and age. But it's and I don't think he's British, so humor me for a second. But like a J.D. Dillard would be great because
Oh my
he's
God, that'd
someone
be
that
cool.
knows how to make regular studio movies. And
Man, that's a good hire. I like that a
well,
lot.
I've been fan casting him for every franchise under the sun, but
But he's not British.
but I think the
Yeah,
director,
that's but
the director's where they're gonna make the most splash. I feel like.
Oh my God.
well, most
Joe,
splash goes
Joe
Nolan.
Cornish comes in after the Quantum of Solace theme song.
Oh yeah.
But he's a good director.
Can we have like the sad trombone version of the Quantum of Solace theme song on the
That'd be
trailer?
so funny.
That
if
would be
Joe
the
Cornish
best
got
thing
it.
ever.
Because it can't be like these big. You gotta be like, you don't want Vaughn or Ritchie or even
No.
Edgar Wright.
People-
Edgar Wright's too, like, he's in his own
They're
place.
already done that thing, but that's the boring corporate thing. Is they've done that
Yeah.
thing. They know how to do this.
That's why I'm sure he will make a good movie, so I'm not going to weep. But that's why I don't want Nolan because
Yeah.
he's
He
done
doesn't
that.
need it.
Oh,
He's
that
done.
too.
That's the same thing as Lucas doing Star Wars. He did Star Wars, he could do the other thing he wanted to. Nolan
Yeah.
did Inception and Tenet because he
Exactly.
couldn't do Bond. Like, it's like
Yeah.
he's already satisfied this.
Yeah,
And that to
And
me
his
would be a
Batman,
sign of
Batman.
pandering to
He's-
the fans.
And Batman for that. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
exactly.
Batman
Like, he
Begins
did
is
all
a
the
Bond
things
film,
that he
so,
could do
yeah.
that weren't Bond, and look at, and he only won Oscars in billion-dollar movies. Terrible. For him. I don't have a
Oh.
filmmaker in mind that I could name because it's like, what does that amount to? I mean, like,
Yeah.
yes, I could name like a dream list of people that would be cool, but at the same time, it's not like I thought like Roger Spottiswoode and Michael Apted were like definitely going to make great
Right.
Bond movies, and yet here we are, we sit and being like, World Not Enough is a great Bond movie. Like, we're among the few, even though it was a well-reviewed movie at the time, made money. Never doesn't matter about history. But it's like I could, if I want to say Martin Campbell, cool, I could say it. Like,
Yeah.
that'd be great. I
Yeah.
wouldn't be against this at all.
but
But-
it'd be his third time, and is the third time gonna work?
No, but
Yeah.
I mean, it's less about like what that weird possibility. It's more of there's no name I could say that would make me like automatically like yes, this is the best thing up because I've seen randos come in and do a great job anyway.
Yeah.
Like I would,
I think
there's
like,
names you could say that I would be annoyed by because like
yeah.
why? But I don't think they would choose those names to begin with.
Well, you got
They're,
like
they're not making Sean Levy's Bond. Let's put that out.
I was thinking in the type of like the Mendez type route, Edward Berger could be.
That'd be
Well, they very
Burger's
much
an amazing
imagine
option right
he's
there. Look at
on
the run he's on
Yeah.
right now.
Yeah, I would
And
be like,
that fits. That fits what Scott's saying. Like
Mhm.
this kind of
Yeah.
like guy that just gets how to do this thing, has a sense of flair to himself. He'd
Yeah.
bring in his composer, would make a fucking great Bond
Yeah.
score. Oh my god.
Yeah.
I love this.
That's
Let's
one
do
of
this
the
right now.
reasons
Let's all have
Conclave
fun.
works so well.
I'm
It's
too
like,
excited about
what
this.
if an Oscar picture was trashy fun?
Uh-huh. That's like getting Mendez to do these.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah, that's
like
what I'm
you
saying,
said,
yeah.
like it's like that's cool. And like, yeah, if I want to like rack my brain and be like, these are the cool kind of guys that you could like, yeah, I can hum up those answers. I just don't have.
I mean, sometimes those guys fell, like, Mark Forster with like Kite Runner was pretty good, and then he.
I think Mark Forster's his batting average is very low for me, but I understand what you're saying.
Yeah.
That seems like an interesting pick, at least. I get that.
Mhm.
That's
And
fine.
I well, go ahead, Scott.
Well, no, I mean, obviously it was a different time, but certainly in 1994, I guess 93, when oh boy, the guy that did No Escapes doing Goldeneye, yippee skippy. I mean, it
Yeah.
was almost like because he was sort of a B movie hack for the eyes of most people. I mean, yes, he did some
Sure.
great
So, but
British
it's
television,
like that's why it could
but
go either way. Like when they announced Sam
exactly.
Mendes for Skyfall, great. That sounded really
Yeah.
cool to me,
Uh-huh.
and it delivered. When they announced, I, you got the Lee Tamahori. When they announced Lee Tamahori, I think, and it doesn't help that
Yeah.
that movie's not great. Let's go with Apted. Apted's a better example. When you announced Michael
Yeah.
Apted of the Up series, the late Michael Apted, I'm sitting there being like, I mean, okay, like that's like, I mean, he's a good filmmaker, so it's hard to gauge like what am I gonna, if Amazon announces tomorrow some really cool filmmaker, I'll probably be like, great, that sounds awesome.
Yeah.
If they announce some guy that's been in the business for a long time and seems to know what he's doing, I'll probably be like, okay, cool, let's get a good Bond movie out of that.
Well, I mean, in the '80s, Bond just had John Glenn, who would
Yeah,
work
Glenn the whole
worked his way up through the system.
or you have Gilbert, or you just.
Somebody, yeah, people like
But
that.
but nowadays, yeah, they don't have like a house crew they can work with unless they get, I don't know, Alexander Witt from Second Unit to make a Bond movie. But the
Right.
last time he made a movie, he made the Resident Evil movie that only Scott likes in the world.
Which one is
Ooh.
that?
It's the second one.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Oh yeah. Ooh.
Yes.
But
I
yeah.
saw it
So
once 15, 20 years, 15 years.
Although they could get, what's his name? Who did U.S. Marshals? What's his Stuart Baird. Stuart, if it was
oh,
Stuart
Stuart
Baird did a
Baird. Oh
Bond
yeah,
movie,
yeah.
between that
And,
and what is that executive decision? That's like, but that's U.S.,
and
so
that-
it doesn't matter. He's
and
not
that's
in
sort
there.
of the issue is that the people that we can think of in terms of being sturdy, reliable action filmmakers on the Hollywood level are generally very old. And
Yeah.
that's not bad necessarily, but theoretically, you'd want somebody that was, and again, this is where the problem is, with the lack of studio programmers, if you will, is that we have so few people that we think of that are experienced at making like movies, but aren't 80 years old, so to speak.
Unless you're George Miller or Ridley Scott, yes, I'm not really sitting there being
Yeah.
like, I hope they get the oldest guy possible to make this
And that's
because
why,
because they made good movies once back in a long time
would I
ago.
be
Right.
happy if Martin Campbell came back? Sure, why not? Because
Yeah.
I tend to like his movies. But, it's not the same Martin Campbell from 1995 or even 2006.
And he's not working with the Broccoli's again.
Yeah.
And
Um,
director in the right spot. Like, I can't say writers because Bond's had the same in-house writers for a couple decades now. Like,
let Shyamalan write that fucker.
Yeah, I mean, you could. Yes, they've had the same writers, and so if they were to continue to do it, I just hope that they would contend with the modern times in the appropriate way as far as how do
folks, we've uncanceled Paul Haggis. He's coming back.
Yeah. Like, I'd be more concerned if they're like, yes, we got those writers, but we also brought in, I don't know, any number of Marvel writers that keep writing,
All due respect, the Rick and
Feely
Morty
and those
guys.
guys that do Captain Americas and it's like,
Yeah.
and that's not even to say their talent isn't there. It's just more, I'm automatically expecting something that's more closed in than widening out.
You know what? I'm gonna put my Who hat on here, but Stephen Moffat, I would trust a
Stephen
script from
Moffat
him.
makes a lot of sense.
Sherlock, that Dracula show he did was badass. Doctor Who stuff, like he's a very clever writer with good plot devices and knows how to really make things hum. So like,
He's
British.
He can think in a more than one movie, like a long game kind of way as well.
Yeah.
If they want
So
to keep going with
I've
that.
got Stephen Moffat writing an Edward Berger film. There we go.
Richard Curtis.
But like, and then
to let him direct also, for the fuck's sake. Let's see what he can do.
And then like with Bond, like he's typically a person to the United States eyes, a relatively unknown. It's not somebody who just came off the street. There is Lazenby, but he's literally the only one who came off the street. Like,
yeah.
And he was
literally homeless. It was sad.
2 times they've hired well-known. Say Roger Moore and Pierce Brosnan. Those were the 2 times which Pierce Brosnan was an up-and-comer, but like
He
he
had a
was
show,
originally
a couple
cast.
movies.
He was going to be cast and then dropped and then brought back to another time. But and Dalton wasn't unknown. Like he was. I mean, to a United press in the
Me,
United
but
States,
yeah, I mean, I was 7 years
probably
old.
Daniel Craig. He'd been in a couple movies. If you saw him, you saw him. Be like, oh, that guy. But and he was riding high off Layer Cake was the big
Yes.
one
Riding
Pretty
High
much
is, I
every
mean, like he's critically liked by the people that
by the
saw it.
film nerd
yeah,
people.
the
Yeah,
people in the know all treated that movie as a metaphorical audition for Bond, fair
like
or not.
right now, that would your Daniel Craig to pull out would probably be Dan Stevens if we're going generic white guy, which I've been touting the Dan
There's,
Stevens horn for a while, but
That is not
he's
the world's worst choice if he's allowed to be a little weird.
yeah.
I mean, that's an idea. It's the guy from Slow Horse, Jack Lowden. Jack Lowden, Slow
Oh,
Horses. He's the
he's
like
auditioning right now by
he's
via
the guy
Slow
that's auditioning
Horses.
for Bond, right?
Yeah,
And he's young too. Dan Stevens he's not old, but he's
yeah.
the more
Bond,
we
What's Jack
go, the
Lorden
further
doing?
away he gets. Jack Lowden's like in his 20s, I think, still, if not
yeah, but
early
Bond's
30s.
typically supposed to be late 30s, early 40s. So that's, but they'll
Well, it
probably
depends on
give
like
you
the
that.
direction we're going with it too, right?
Yeah, I
Casino
mean they
was
almost went with Cavill last. It was down to him and Craig, and Cavill was like 28,
Mhm.
but Broccoli's didn't want Cavill. So
So if your next question is like, who would they cast that would excite you? Like I think I've already
yeah,
made it clear. Like,
my cast is like I want to learn who this person is. That's the
Yeah.
thing. I want
Yeah.
them to become a star from Bond, not already well-known person that you think is popular because the internet likes them.
Yeah.
yeah, and
I
like
would be far more excited if they announced this is Bond. It's somebody I've almost never heard of.
Mm-hmm.
I would agree. And like I don't like to
Yeah.
play the Idris Elba, Tom Hiddleston games or whatnot. Dev Patel's like the closest I get to that, just
Yeah.
because I honestly think that would be really fucking cool.
Yeah.
And it matches certain things I want about a Bond. But I agree with you. I think ideally it would be someone that doesn't already have multiple Oscar-winning films under their belt or multiple TV series or both. Like it would be
the
someone that
thing
has
with
maybe
Idris
been on the
Elba is he started that way, and then other people
Mhm.
found out, and till it became the ultimate boring black guy choice for James Bond. But when it
Everything,
started,
actually.
when it started, Elba wasn't as known. And then he became more, oh, that guy. Oh, and then someone heard someone say that he should be James Bond, so they jump on the train and they jump on the train. But when it started, I would agree it was a good
Oh yeah, early
choice.
on.
But then it's
Yeah.
like then it became like, could we shut up? There's other black actors other than Idris Elba out there that could play James Bond.
And
But-
I mean, I'm not saying I want this, but if they wanted to like do something more anthology-esque where Idris Elba gets one movie as Bond because he's not exactly getting any younger, and then they give Dev Patel one movie as Bond, and basically it's almost like a different actor every time. And whether it's fan casting or not, that's a different conversation. Or they just do what I suggested 10 years ago and give these people all transporter sequels where you get to be Bond with none of the cultural baggage.
Oh, you have Statham as Bond, right? There you go. James Bond, motherfucker.
You know what I mean?
No, man. Yeah. So, yeah, it's really weird. Like the Bond, the less I know of them, I feel like the better it's going to be with it. And you hook a young person to a multi-film deal that they don't realize they're going to have to
that's
fulfill.
why Jeff Bezos' tweets notwithstanding, whatever they're called these days, I'd be shocked if they went with somebody that was famous enough to actually ask for money.
Yeah, so that's why if we're in the positive section, what you're asking, Brandon, is stuff I'm all basically hoping is going to be the case. I'm
Mhm.
pretty I'd like to, it might be too optimistic of me, but I'd like to assume that is going to be the probability. They will hire a director that makes a lot of sense. They'll find somebody that's not too well known, this, that, and the other, as far as like the behind, who are they, who's being put in this thing. So like beyond that, what are the other things that could be done that would assure, well, one, just don't make other shows. Like, let's do away with that right now. But I'd like to hope, and like in a positive way to steer the Bond films, honestly, make one every 3 or 4 years again.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
we like the Daniel Craig films for the most part, 2 caveats side, one main one. But there's a lot of time in between those Bob. He's like we were waiting around. to, like,
I mean,
sit
he
there
has
and be like,
he didn't have the most movies, but he had the longest reign of Bond by years.
Yeah,
Yeah,
which
which
is
is weird.
kind of silly. Like, so
Yeah.
if anything, it adds to. I think it aided Daniel Craig as an actor. Honestly, like I do think
Yeah,
No Time to Die is in my like middle of the pack as far as his run of Bonds. But I think his performance is really good in that movie. So
It was
agreed.
just a couple years short of being his James Bond was a couple years short of being part of 2 writer strikes.
yeah,
That's
which
how
is
close it
wild.
was.
So like if there's something Amazon could do and probably could do, given that they have the means or whatnot, and they're not being,
Hmm.
I don't know, whatever the
Overly
broadcast
precious.
process is, they could make a more consistent level of Bond like it used to be back in the 60s, 70s, 80s, where it's like, yeah, here it comes, and another, here it comes again.
Well, you could
Here-
And
do
I
that.
think that would alleviate a lot of our concerns in that if they are every 2 to 3 years, then there's less pressure on each one to be the
the
definitive
best.
greatest Bond film of all time. Because when you watch them all, and when you watch them all, as I did in the early days of lockdown, one per day for like a month. And when you watch them as just that night's Bond film, most of them are varying degrees of good.
Oh
You
no,
know,
the thing that kills some of these Bond movies is watching them in a marathon, and then that lessens some that are pretty good, but they become lesser when they follow such a strong one, or they're the third in a row.
I'm not sure I agree with that because there were
Okay.
some that I liked more just because they were that night's Bond adventure.
Mm.
I think when I watched all, up to Spectre, the 3 that I still think are just bad: Diamonds Are Forever, View to a Kill, and Spectre. And the second half
I
of
didn't
Diamonds
hear
Are Good.
Man with the Golden Gun. Anyway,
Yeah, I know. Isn't that shocking?
uh,
I find it's the low tier Bond, but I like it
Yeah,
more
it's
than
low
three
tier, but
Bond. I like it more than
it's
2 of the ones Bond Scott just said.
yeah.
So
fair. And
Um,
it's just Band with the Golden Gun. I think it follows a weird pattern of the second Bond for each actor is like the mean, nasty one, comparatively speaking.
is Tomorrow Never Dies the mean nasty one?
I thought it was. I mean, again, I don't think it's grotesque or anything, but I mean,
I think
Terry
World Is Not
Hatcher.
Enough.
Terry
there's a
Hatcher.
lot of
Terry Hatcher
there's,
dies, man. It's
yeah,
mean.
there's some. It's the one where he straight up executes somebody.
I mean, he gets tortured in one, and like
Mhm.
World Is
Yeah.
Not Enough. Sophie Marceau's, she's mean. I don't know.
um,
Is Live and Let Die the mean one? I mean, like, what is it?
no, the
You're
Man with the
right.
Golden Gun.
Golden Gun. That's
Oh,
the
this man.
second.
Wrong movie. Sorry.
And I was shocked. I was not expecting it to be as
What's
Sec-
your
down
the
and
second
dirty as it
hour
was.
of On Her Majesty's Secret Service is a little meaner.
Oh, is it?
Yeah.
It ends happily though, right? I saw them drive
Yeah,
off
I
in the
know.
car.
I turned it off
I
after the
kind of
wedding.
walk
I
out of the
assume
room
everything's
after they drive
great.
off in the car. It's like, yeah, they got married.
Yeah.
That's great for them.
Yeah.
It's weird that the wife never showed up again in another movie.
Well, in that post-credit scene where Connery shows up and he's like, "Hey, bud, you go sulk. I got this." That's like crazy.
The thing you're kind of leaning on, both of you guys, that I do think is also a positive, or at least a potential positive, is the fact that unlike the Marvels and the Star Wars that either are making up stuff or have to guide it based on the years before, what have you, Bond is a formula. Like
Yeah.
when you do that formula well, rocks.
And he copies.
It's a formula that's repetitive, that's done the thing over, it's remade You Only Live Twice a lot.
A couple times.
And if I'm looking at a positive aspect of what Amazon could be doing, it's the fact that there's not a lot of room to screw up. Granted that you have a writer that understands both the formula in place that's been working for literally decades, as well as ways to modernize it that feel appropriate for the time. As we've said many times in the commentaries and just in life, Bond movies are always responding to the time, right? There's Kung Fu Bond, there's blaxploitation Bond, there's gritty
Space Adventure
era
Bond.
Bond, there's Space Bond, there's Bourne Bond, there's Nolan Bond. Like if you make, I don't know what, David Leitch Bond, like Magnum and John Wick Bond. I mean, like that makes a lot of sense, but I mean, there's such a pattern in place that if you stay out, I'm not saying stay on the guardrails entirely, but at least there's something there for you to follow that it's hard to like mess up unless you really drop the ball. So if it like that's
and
it's
the
an easier thing to
fundamentals
look
are
at.
there.
Mm-hmm.
The fundamentals are there already, so you can just choose to what extent you deviate.
Yes.
And that's hopefully where the uniqueness comes.
Mm-hmm.
As far as responding to the times, and This is not my problem. But how the fuck do you make a James Bond film in a world where basically Blofeld won and copious Blofelds now rule the world with an iron fist, and everybody is in the grip of autocratic tyranny.
I mean, that's
Yeah.
to me, if I was a writer that wanted to get creative on Bond, I would be so fucking excited to do that. I would be so excited to be the one that's trying to tackle that story and invest my life in saying, I want to be the guy that can make a Bond movie that's relevant now based on what's going on in the world.
That's
That seems like a really cool challenge to me.
that's the guy winning the pitch meeting in my book. Yeah.
Exactly. And that's what I
Yeah.
want to see. Like I don't want to see a side skirting of it being like, it's not really a thing. We're going to go fantasy world and do whatever we want to. I want to see a Bond that like rises to the challenge of making a Bond that exists in 2027.
And I gotta say, in terms of like, if they're
So in other
going to
words,
do
James Bond, Mad Max Fury Road.
right, if they're going to do a must do
The
spinoff or
Road.
have a series streaming, I would hope I would want them to, going back to Star Wars, I would take the George Lucas Star Wars model instead of the Disney Star Wars model, whereas George made a trilogy post the original trilogy. He had a couple TV Ewok movies. He had the droids cartoons and such. Did some video games and whatnot. Then he came back with the prequel trilogy, and those were the only thing going on at that time. Then after that, he had the Clone Wars cartoon, and then he had some other cartoon that got or some other thing that got yoinked.
So you're saying you want
for
the James Bond holiday special?
Sure. But just like between Bond, what you do is you make however many Bonds you're gonna make with the Bond, and to put some distance between that Bond and the next Bond, maybe if you must put the streaming series there, where it's something. It's not as important as the A game of that, but it's there, um, for the movies to feel like, oh, they're back again, or like something like that. But we
Well,
always
yeah,
know,
because I
we
mean,
always do know James Bond will return. Star Wars was I should have figured it was coming back type thing, but
and it's worth remembering for what it's worth that a lot of the James Bond ripoff slash cash-ins or whatever, whether it's If Looks Could Kill, which I am a fan of, whether it's James Bond Jr., which I am not, that those took place with that 6-year gap between License to Kill and GoldenEye. So there
Yeah.
were in True Lies, which, if I recall, GoldenEye was delayed because it ended up being slightly similar to True Lies in certain ways, in terms of the action. But so that it's just weird that and this is one of the challenges to be solved, in that almost more than any other franchise, James Bond movie is arguably a franchise unto or a genre unto itself.
mm-hmm.
I mean, you look at something like The Kingsman, that's a James Bond movie. Austin Powers, that's a James Bond movie. Mission Impossible, kind of sort of a James Bond movie. The later Fast and Furious movies, now they're playing the James Bond sandbox.
Also, don't go. We're gonna adapt the books properly. We don't need it. It's too late.
As an 8-episode miniseries.
Yeah,
Oh, gosh, I can hear you.
don't do that. We don't need that. We don't. There's some titles you can still use, like 007 in New York, Property of a Lady. There's a couple, but don't.
What's Kevin McClary's estate up to these days?
Yeah, true. But yeah, so I don't know. That's kind of that's where we're at here with these. Like I'm a bit at the time apprehensive, but I imagine they don't get started on this. I heard the papers, they won't be signed and sealed till the end of the year anyway. So, 2027 is probably the earliest we're looking at this James Bond.
So you're saying you're apprehensive, like that's where your like current like state is.
I don't trust at this point until I start to see it, what they're doing, like who's being brought on board. But when they announced a Bond, remember Craig? He came out in this boat and stuff, and they had are they gonna do that? Are they gonna make it an event like that every step of the way? Where, here's
I imagine they
who's,
will.
and then they do the song. The person's doing the song. Like, are people gonna bid for the song like they used to? Or the Bond also came with a process when they were making these movies, but that also happens when you're a family and that's all you make is Bond.
I agree
Like,
with you. I would say, like, if you're gonna take my temperature on this after this conversation and just having a week to consider it, like, I'd say I'm less apprehensive than you, just because I don't have enough from Amazon specifically to tell me that they're going to.
and that's what I learned too when I was thinking about it. Yeah.
Yeah.
They're not. I don't have enough from Amazon to tell me that they're going to milk this into oblivion. That's not me saying it's impossible to see it happen, but in terms of if I was going to gauge, if Disney bought this, I'd have a lot more concerns. Amazon buying this, especially if I look at like Lord of the Rings, for example, which I think is fine. I think it's doing the job. I don't see them like shilling that in a way that's making that feel like it's less special or whatnot. Like, it's here nor there as far as how it compares to the Jackson movies, but in terms of what they're doing with that franchise so far, it's not like they announced like the Gandalf spin-off or anything like that. They're just like, yeah, we got this season and we got this season, and we spent a shit ton of money on it.
And let's be clear here. 98% of the people don't give a shit. Don't know this is going on, don't care. New James Bond is coming or whatever. They won't know till they see a trailer or
Yeah,
something. So,
and so that's like it's entirely speculation. So if I'm gonna be up in arms about something right now, I'm not even necessarily disappointed because I look at it's like, yeah, they're old. Like they got to get rid of this at some point. Like I get it. I get you can't just keep doing this thing. I'm sitting here just thinking, yes, I'm an eternal optimist, which is not the easiest right now, but I'd like to think that there's enough smart thinking going into why did we acquire this if we're just gonna do the worst things possible to it. I'd like to think better heads are prevailing. That's not being saying they're definitely gonna make a knockout of the Park Bond movie, but I don't know, Bond curious right now about what the result is gonna be.
in terms of spies and Amazon, my favorite new show last year was Mr. and Mrs. Smith.
That was great. Put Glover on Bond.
Yeah.
Put Glover and Hero, his director friend Mirai. They'd be great.
Yeah. So I'm like, well, they did do that. So it's like I hate to be advocating for the enemy, but like
Which is a
yeah.
shit property, by the way. Like, who thought Mr. and Mrs. Smith was like, oh, finally, they took this. Like, yes, and it turned out to be great.
It's
So,
like legit, yeah, awesome. So I'm like, all right, but like I think we keep throwing because Amazon lacks a identity sort of at this time that we pigeonhole them to being like, oh, they're just like Netflix or this is what Disney did to a property, and it's like we haven't seen Amazon do this with anything. We've seen them get Lord of the Rings and they made a show. Like that's
Yeah.
where we're at.
that, regardless of, again, quality wise, it looks like the money they spent
It does
on.
look expensive.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think the trepidation, to the extent that I don't want to say I don't care because that sounds mean, but we've been having James Bond films for 60 years. The last one ended pretty fucking definitively. I would be even less who gives a shit if we lived in a healthier theatrical ecosystem where it wasn't just franchises, and franchises. Where like in 1995, I love GoldenEye, everybody knows that, but if GoldenEye comes out and it's like one of the worst movies of the year, there's still a gajillion other movies that are awesome that year. That's totally fine. I mean, even 2006, Superman Returns probably was the worst movie of the year, give or take. But there are still plenty of other films that I loved that year. Most of them were not franchise pictures because those still existed. And
you know what could be telling? Oh, sorry.
No. I think the Disney example is crucial because they were doing it right until they got scared. Now, do I love The Force Awakens? I do not. But especially after The Last Jedi, I was totally willing and able to embrace Force Awakens as a necessary evil. Something that, okay, this is fan service that still does some interesting things. It plays with the Arthurian lore. And obviously the incel nerd villain was very prophetic.
And the casting is very strong in that movie.
Yeah, Adam Driver is just giving 10,000%, as is John Boyega. And, they're all good. And that safe takeoff leads to, okay, this is reasserting Star Wars. Now, where do we go from here? And again, do I think everybody in the world loved The Last Jedi as much as I did? No, of course not. That's not the way the world worked. But, if they had just stayed the course, they'd be in a very different space. And I think, when Force Awakens was coming out, this was a Disney that was releasing films like Zootopia and Iron Man 3. And I don't love it, but Maleficent, I always make this joke that's like I spit on your grave for kids. So they were doing interesting things with these properties that they had. The idea of a Disney Star Wars was not something to fear.
True.
And
And
it was only after,
well, I was gonna say it's gonna be very telling and maybe a warning for the Bond people to see what the box office turnout is for Mandalorian and Grogu when that comes out. Because look where you start and look what happened when you went too crazy.
Mhm.
It
As
could be a
George
good,
Lucas once said, it's possible to destroy these things.
yeah. I wonder what the turnout's going to be like that for.
But,
Here's the
in a
season
macro
finale of our
sense,
television show on the big screen. Lost
but
threatened to do that a lot, but it never
yeah, so
happened.
did Game of Thrones, if I recall.
Yeah.
But in a macro sense, it's, I genuinely, it's like, okay, if it comes out and it's terrible, or they kill the franchise through oversaturation and or all the horror stories, aside from the fact that I work in the industry and have to be always on the ball about what's being done, have hot takes about every development, which can be sometimes a pain in the ass. As a consumer, okay, whatever. I had 60 years of good to great Bond films.
It's
I
true.
want something else.
Yeah. You gotta embrace that and be the reality of the situation is we're like, oh no, the thing I already have 25 of, and they've done bad ones before. Uh, could
I
be.
was gonna ask, what's another example of something like this happening? Then I realized, well, it's Star Wars and the MCU.
Yeah.
That's the answer to
Yeah.
that question, and more or less mixed result. Well, I mean, no, like MCU goes from Paramount to Disney, and they skyrocket honestly for 10
Hmm.
years. It's not the worst result. Star Wars goes to Disney, and they make $4 billion movie. I mean, I don't know.
Yeah.
Indiana
It's
Jones goes to Disney, and no.
I feel like
Yeah.
I don't think I don't think it matters what studio Indiana Jones is with for that to be the
No.
Yeah.
way it was.
Right. No.
I know I know you're
I was
kind of
making a joke.
Yeah.
I know. I can't
And
like
even Marvel, I'm
there's no other like giant franchise that's like entirely shifted forces in that way I can think of.
well,
Right?
until the Conjuring universe gets, sold to Pureflix or whatever.
Finally.
Where we wanted it.
Angel Studios presents Annabelle 12.
I like look around my shelves, like what franchises are there?
I mean, the only
Um,
thing left, like, because a family owned is the Halloween. They've moved to different studios to sell their stuff, their product,
But you,
and
you could argue their move to Bloomhouse what is a weird kind of success in its own way.
yeah.
yeah. And Malik Akkad has taken risks his father wouldn't
Yeah.
since taking over. His father got really scared off by that Halloween 3 and, didn't really take the chance. And he made a let me listen to the fans kind of movie, and we got his final one, Resurrection. So, yeah. Yeah, so Halloween remains. Aaron, you mentioned to me that the El Mariachi and Spy Kids remain at home with
Yeah.
um,
Rodriguez.
Rodriguez. So I mean, it's very limited. Like I read this book a few years ago called The Long Goodbye, which was about the writing of Chinatown.
Mhm.
And in the book, there's a moment where The Exorcist does big numbers at the box office, and I can't remember if it was Town or somebody fears that like this is it, this is the end. And they're like, what do you mean? They're like the the big corporate overlords are seeing this and they see the dollars and they're coming. They're going to they're going to want a piece of this. They're going to come over, and look what we're seeing. Like this, exactly what's here is they come to take the industry and the art dies or whatever,
Look,
as they say.
but what a call he made 50 years later in these terrible movies.
Yeah.
It takes. I mean, it takes
It's
its
like the
time.
people that called superhero fatigue in 2015. It's like, I was right a
Well-
decade later for reasons that, a global pandemic and the new
Look what-
lead actor dying of cancer. I
Well-
totally called that.
Look what happened. I mean, look what happens instantly the 80s to the directors of the 70s.
Yeah, I know. It becomes a
So-
producer-driven field that's less tour crazy like the 70s. But it's waves. That's how things always are. It's
Yeah.
waves. It's
Yeah.
not a straight line. It's waves.
And as we've seen in the corporate structure and stuff like that, Guardians of the Galaxy movies can happen. Black Panther can happen. stuff Last Jedi can happen. Like there's stuff that can, it's just how the person plays ball is in there. And, I don't know.
I think, it's not my place to give advice because who gives a shit? But in light of that, I genuinely believe when people, when a movie like Barbie or Black Panther comes out, the things always like, people want original stories. And they're like, no, they don't want original stories. They don't want original IP, but they will embrace and accept, if not embrace, challenging outside the box filmmaking within the safe franchises that they were already going to show up for. So maybe they didn't expect Barbie, maybe they walked into Barbie expecting something from the Brady Bunch, the movie in 1995. But they obviously got something very different, arguably more challenging. I mean, it's basically an adaptation of Elizabeth Blank's For the Love of Men.
It's more challenging than the Brady Bunch, yes.
Yeah, and they fucking showed up and kept going and going and going.
And
I don't know if people.
But
well, no, it's something like it's the lesson of the Lego Movie. You use the protection and safety of the Surefire brand to make something in one way or another that is challenging
nowadays.
Yeah, and potential shortlist for Bond director Denis Villeneuve with Dune took something that was the laughing stock of cinematic franchise sci-fi history, and now is two-time Academy Award Best Picture nominated for that same thing. And
like I was so and my skepticism came from the popularity aspect. I would assume that Denis Villeneuve would make a quality Dune film, but I was sitting there being like, who's gonna see this? Like this is this feels like a real stretch as far as trying to get audiences going for. And you know what? Now I love Dune. Give me all the Dune you want.
Well, and then you're like, is he a household name then? Like people showing up because he built some cred with Blade Runner. I mean, Arrival, Blade Runner,
I think that like it's less of, it's not Tarantino where just the name sells, but I do think the director of Dune has a lot more to it than not having that.
Yes. Yeah. But I'm sure they'll give him
Nolan at this point. I think Nolan is like a name.
Yeah, Nolan's movie star.
I don't give a shit what it is. I'm seeing it. Yeah.
But I mean, for general audiences that have to go by actual like identifying, not just like from the director of this or that, but like if you said the words Christopher Nolan to them, they would understand that it's associated with something. If you said Denis Villeneuve to them, I don't think that's right there yet, but I do think if you say the director of Dune, yes.
Yeah.
If you say the director of Paddington, yes. If you say Paul King,
that's another one. I mean, I didn't love Wonka, but clearly it worked.
That's what I'm saying. It's not Paul King's name, but the director of Paddington. There's a Bond director. What are we talking about? Let's get Paul King. Let's get those writers on this.
That is the Barbenheimer effect. Is trailers are selling who directed a lot more now than they used to. Which is
my pie in the sky theory, and this was the summer of 2019. So obviously COVID sort of shit the bed on this. My hope was that the 2020s would start an era where we'd have more butts and seats marquee directors, John M. Chu, James Wan, Chris Nolan, obviously, Ryan Johnson coming off Last Jedi and then Knives Out, actually, Edgar Wright. And I don't know whether I was wrong or whether just history changed. Maybe both.
I'd argue you do have that. It's just coming in the form of these IPs I recognized and enjoyed a lot. I'm going to see the next spring from the person that made those IPs, not the name of that person. I don't fucking care about their name. I know that they made X, Y, and Z. I know that they made Barbie. I don't necessarily know the name Greta Gerwig. I know they made that though. That's which I'm mixed about. Like the fact that you're choosing to see a film based on the quality of said previous film, that's one thing. But the fact that you're not only, but like in a general sense, you're only going because I recognize that this franchise had great entries, therefore I'm going to see the next film for the person that made those great franchise entries.
Well, I think
that's not a bad thing. They're going to the movies.
I think if use an obvious example, because it's a month from now, ish, 2 months from now. Anyway, if people say, "Oh, that random vampire-ish horror movie that's completely original, but it's the guy that directed Black Panther," if people show up, then by all means.
Oh, I absolutely think
Black Panther. They can see that one of the stars.
Yeah, I think that it's riding high on that, and I'm not gonna.
Yeah.
I mean, I feel like already, Scott. Like,
whatever it's tracking
at. There's no world where we're not going to see the look at this an original thing surprises when it's like no, black people want to see a black people movie. Like that's
Yeah.
like, that's not a surprise once again.
Haley Steinfeld for the win.
Right. But
Um,
like F1 this summer, absolutely going to be sold on not Joe, not
Yeah.
Krasinski, but
It's Top Gun.
they're going to be sold on Top Gun
But the
Maverick.
director,
I
but
love
only the
Top Gun
brave,
Maverick.
which
I
you
saw
should
that
have
8 times
fucking
in
seen
theaters.
by now.
Let me see F1. Like that's the
Yeah.
exactly the
Mhm.
sell.
and yes, if that is able to transfer for a non-franchise, awesome. I think for me, the pessimistic version of that scenario where, the guy you loved in X-Men, and it's a terrible example because it bombed, but humor me for a second. The guy whose X-Men movie you loved is now making a Superman movie. And to me, that is of no value in terms of, widening the net of what's
Right.
potentially successful.
Right.
Um,
It's yeah. I get
We're
you.
also answering a brand with a brand, right? Which I also wonder if how
Yeah.
that is.
Which is like when you went, oh, J.J. Abrams got Star Trek back. Let's do Star Wars back. Like
but which the difference there is
it
Star Wars-
worked a lot.
Star Wars is the biggest thing ever. So it's
Yeah.
like it's
Yeah.
not like Disney was like, let's make sure to say from the director of Star Trek on it. There's like it's Star Wars. You're gonna fucking see it. Like
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
um,
Star Wars doesn't advertise like that too.
For the director
so,
of Super 8 and Mission Impossible 3. Finally, we got somebody good in the chair, okay?
that Richard Marquand hat.
From the writer of the Pallbearer. Finally, we got somebody. From the uncredited rewrite draft of Armageddon, J.J. Abrams is here.
Oh my. Okay. Well, we're getting off the path here a bit, but yeah. So, share with us your thoughts on the bomb thing. I know a lot of people bummed, but they're like I said, taking this time to think about it. I was less like, why? How do I know what Amazon's going to do? Because I don't know what Amazon does. We don't have enough. That all I know is they have a humongous property in Lord of the Rings, and all they've done is make a show.
And they make solid spy series.
And they make a
Mhm.
really good spy show and stuff like that. But it's always weird the corporate overlord taking over your thing and
Your toys. They took your toys. Yeah.
They took It's
Well, I think it's just the feeling, and we've been
mass
dealing with
produced.
this ever since, frankly, Disney bought Lucasfilm 13
Yeah.
years ago,
that's
which
the
is
thing.
that these once spectacular, bigger than life, unique unto themselves properties are under threat of just becoming a content widget in a global empire.
Well, and a front to sell amusement park tickets as well. That's the thing, because like people are like, another Toy Story. I'm like, as long as Toy Story Land is up in Disney, you're going to get a Toy Story movie to remind the kids or get new kids to want to go to the Toy Story place. Like that's the thing. Or else the ride goes away.
I
And
assume that's the only reason we're getting Tron 3.
they got a ride.
It's because people want it. They can't get Morbid time. They're like, what else can we shove them into?
I mean,
Tron!
I'm sure Ratatouille 2 is being worked in the pipeline. They have a ride for that at Epcot. Like, at the end of Guardians of the Galaxy 3, which had a definitive ending, they had Star-Lord will return because we have a ride there, folks. We need to remind people about the Guardians.
Yeah,
So-
he's not dead. I mean, it's Marvel.
Yeah.
Like, what are they gonna do? Say like Star Lord is gone.
They're gonna make their
Dr.
own.
Star-Lord never returned home.
They're gonna make their own Thelma with his grandpa. That'll be what happens. So, anyways, as we wrap this up, James Bond. Let's see where we go here. But thank you, Scott and Aaron, for this scurried about episode here. But in the meantime, where can people find you, Aaron?
You can find me writing all my movie reviews over at WeLiveEntertainment.com. I write Blu-ray and Criterion reviews over at Why So Blue. Everything I do can be found on my personal blog, the Substack, thecodazit.substack.com. I host the show Out Now with Aaron and Abe. We talk about weekly movie releases there. We have a lot of bonus stuff as well. And yes, I also host the podcast Two Black Guys Talk Godzilla, which is gearing up to start in mid-March. We do have like a little introduction episode coming out this week, the time of this recording. But yes, stay tuned for that because my friend Terrence Johnson and I, both film critics, we are very excited to delve into the world of Godzilla on a bi-weekly basis.
Very excited for that. Very, very, very. Scott, what are you doing?
I'm at Pop News on a semi-regular basis. I also write, run, and oversee the Outside Scoop at Substack. I also produce and release the Box Office Podcast, a weekly conversation between myself and usually around 3 other younger, cooler, more culturally relevant box office pundits, where we pontificate and dissect what happened the previous weekend at a theater near you. Spoiler, I'm with Beg Rubio.
All right. And I'm on the socials at Brandon4KUHD. This show has a corresponding YouTube channel. PopCon's Creator Summit was announced last week. I suggest you go check it out, all the info at popconsummit.com. Going to be a great thing with lots of fun, professional, big-name people, ins and outs networking. Going to be really cool. And then, of course, PopCon follows that. You can find the information at popcon.us. I am hosting the podcast stage. Submit for your show if you want to do a live show there. It fills up fast now. I have a waiting list the past couple times, so get in there. And then also the podcast awards. Submit yours for an award, be judged, win an award, who knows. All that, popcon.us. And Brandon Peters' show maybe returns next week, maybe doesn't. I don't know. We shall see. Depends. But till then, stay full positive.
Thank you for listening. The Brandon Peters Show is a Creative Zombie Studios production. Produced by Brad Shoemaker and Brandon Peters. Written and edited by Brandon Peters. Announcer vocals by Jessica Alsman. Theme song by Metavari. Web design and show art by Brad Shoemaker with Brandon Peters. All music and clips featured in the episode are property of their respective studios, and no infringement is intended. Additional information on this and other episodes at BrandonPetersShow.com. For any inquiries, press opportunities, or sponsorship, contact mail at BrandonPetersShow.com. The show is available on Apple Music, Spotify, or anywhere podcasts are found.